for this last section, it talks about North America. And so one of the things is we'll see a variety of different cultures, and all of them develop because of the geography, because of their surroundings. And so we'll talk about this again a little bit next year. But if you think about it, especially the United States today, you've got Alaska to Arizona. Completely different climates, completely different geography. If you go west to east, it's very different. West Coast, you've got, and depending what part you're in, you can do some farming, but you've also got the ocean, you got a lot of seafood. And then as you move from the Appalachians all the way to really probably the western part of Iowa, maybe eastern part of Kansas, Nebraska, you can do an awful lot of farming. But then from there to the Rocky Mountains, you've got the Great Plains, which isn't great for farming. And then the Northwest is pretty good. But if we look at understand how groups of people adapted to the desert environment of the Southwest, and they talk about the Hohokam, the Anasazi, which today would be like the Pueblos and the Hopis. So the areas that we're talking about here, this would be the Hohokam, but all of this is going to eventually be what the Anasazi are. And then you've probably, I guess if you've seen pictures of the cliff dwellings, more than likely that's Chaco Canyon. It's the biggest, probably most famous. But what ends up happening is this culture gets pretty heavily influenced by the Aztecs. So if you look at their culture, they've got a game pretty similar to the game that the Aztecs and the Mayans played. And so there'll be pictures of that. They do an awful lot of trading with the Aztecs, and so that's going to have kind of an influence on them. The way adapted is through these canals. So this is the Gila River, which would be New Mexico, Arizona. But they built these canals so that they could bring water, and the squares are these settlements. So they didn't necessarily have to live right by the rivers. They could build the canals, and that would bring the water into these settlements, and then that's how they survived in what was a relatively desert climate. So this is a game that you would see, they talk a little bit more about it in the book. This is a smaller version of that game, but usually along the side they'd have, I guess, baskets, but instead of going through the, you'd have to throw it through the hoop, kick it through the hoop. And so this Hohokam culture is pretty long. The pottery, most of this stuff has been grave robbed over the centuries, but they have this very distinctive red-white pottery that's going to influence further cultures. And then later on, the Anasazi built their homes into the side of cliffs to protect them from invaders. This would be Chaco Canyon. And then this was Pueblo Bonito, which is probably the largest settlement. This is a recreation of it. But these round areas were kivas. Those kivas were used for religious purposes. They would gather, offer sacrifices, prayers. And then this was on the entrance to Chaco Canyon. If we look at the cultures that develop in the East and analyze the evidence from which we have learned about the emergence of culture, this would be the Hopewells, also the Mound Builders, and the biggest settlement that the Mound Builders had was Cahokia, and that's probably for North America, it would have been the biggest settlement, estimated 30 to 40,000 people at one point in time. But the evidence that we get from this Hopewell culture, all of it comes from the mines. This goes to show the region of the Hopewells, and then also it goes through the major earth complexes. Most of them are in Ohio, but Effigy Mounds is in Iowa, so. And that would show Effigy Mounds State Park. Most of New Albin would have had mounds all throughout New Albin area. There was At one point in time, somewhere around 2,000 of them, most of them have been plowed up and turned into farm fields. But as far away as Boone had some too.
Is this the next chapter?
This is the end of chapter 6. Yep. Effigy mounds, this is the biggest complex that Effigy mounds has. And this is the mound group 3, the marching bear mound group. But from those mounds, then you get the artifacts, and that's what we learned, or that's how we learned about this culture. It was completely gone by the time the Europeans got here. Unlike, for example, the Anasazi, the Aztec, the Anasazi culture were gone too. There were some things that they recognized from the Aztec. Europeans weren't all that surprised. They wondered what happened to those complexes, but it was close enough to the Aztec that Europeans were like, okay, we get it. With the mound builders and Cahokia, everything had disappeared by the time the Europeans showed up. And so they were a little amazed by these structures. And I'll talk about that in a second. But everything we learned from them come from the mounds. And what they figured out is when you look at all of the material that are in there, they've got obsidian from up by the Great Lakes. They have copper from the east. They've got shells from Texas. They have turquoise from the southwest. So you have all of these materials and minerals that come into Cahokia. They turn those things into jewelry, tools, and they export those things back out. So what they realized is these mound builders had a very extensive trading network that pretty much the tentacles of which went all the way from Mexico into Canada, the Atlantic, almost to the Pacific. And if you look at the different figurines, they come from all over the United States as well. So this would be Cahokia. The last remaining thing is this big mound. The mound itself, if you were to walk around it, the base of it is bigger than the Great Pyramid in Egypt. So all the way around it is much bigger. It's just outside of St. Louis. The problem with Cahokia is they realized that this was a huge, enormous settlement. There's no way Native Americans could have possibly built that thing. So where human beings were sacrificed within sight of St. Louis, and it talks about, this article would go on to talk about this mysterious race. And a lot of Europeans and Americans thought it was the lost tribe of Israel. Because obviously Native Americans couldn't have built this. They're not smart enough to do it. They don't have enough manpower to do it. It either had to be the lost tribe of Israel or aliens, one of the two. So it's kind of interesting to see how people interpret different things. Different geographic regions. Then they talk about the Inuit, the Northwest Coast, the Iroquois. So the Inuit would be Eskimos. And of course, igloos, hunt seals, whales for blubber. For the Northwest Coast, they have the most permanent buildings. Almost every other group in the North America are semi-nomadic. They have to move periodically. The Plains Indians move all the time. But even on the East Coast, where they do some farming, every 10 or 15 years, the soil is depleted. They have to pick up and move their villages. With the Northwest Coast, it's such a plentiful place in terms of just fruits, nuts. You've got big game, deer, moose, salmon. They just have plenty of stuff. And so they build more permanent shelters. They build wooden homes. And they also host what are called potlatches. Sounds an awful lot like potluck, which is what?
People bring a lot of food.
People bring a lot of food, you enjoy. The wealthier you are, the bigger the potlatch you throw. You provide all of the food for all of the local people. And that kind of shows your wealth, your power. I had such a good year that I'm going to give away all the stuff I collected. just to show what a good year I had. And so they'd have these big, huge potlatches, which is where we get potlucks from. It would be a community celebration. The Iroquois are the ones that the Europeans first encountered. What's kind of interesting about the Iroquois is you've got these 5 tribes that were once enemies of each other. And because of the Huron and the Ojibwe, what they end up doing is they end up uniting into the Iroquois Confederacy. They write a constitution, or I guess they have a spoken constitution, but they have an organized way for all 5 of these tribes to interact and work with one another. What ends up happening is Benjamin Franklin discovers that, uses part of it to help draft, which becomes eventually our Constitution. A way to unite 13 independent states, and they turned to the Iroquois Confederacy as a way to do that.